All right, hello everyone, and welcome to The Current, the North Central Region Water Network Speed Networking webinar series. My name is Ann Nardi. I'm joining you from the University of Wisconsin Extension, and I'm filling in for Rebecca Power, the Network Director, as the moderator for today's session. For those of you who may be new to the North Central Region Water Network, we are a 12-state extension-led collaboration working to ensure safe and sufficient water supplies by enhancing connectivity, developing and executing outreach and education, and coordinating extension-led projects. We're excited to have you join us today on Imagine a Day Without Water, a day where we're all asked to imagine not having a resource that so many of us can take for granted, not having water to drink, to make coffee with, to water our crops with. So today is really a day to raise awareness and education about the value of water. And today's session will feature speakers from 3 communities, Flint, Michigan, Kewaunee County, Wisconsin, and Toledo, Ohio, where our communities have dealt with water quality concerns and how extension professionals, researchers, and agency staff have come together to respond to the crisis, to establish solutions, and to work to prevent future water quality impairments. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items for you. We will have our speakers present first, who will do roughly 3 10-minute presentations, and then that will be followed by Q&A. While they're presenting, you can submit your questions in the chat box. That is in the purple Collaborate panel in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can also use the call-in option if you're having any audio issues today. That can be accessed by opening the session menu in the upper left-hand corner of your screen and select Use Phone for Audio. As always, this session will be recorded and will be available on our media archive at northcentralwater.org, as well as on our partner e-extension at learn.extension.org. All right, we are very pleased to have our speakers here with us today. We are going to be hearing from Darren Bagley with Michigan State University Extension, Kevin Erb with the University of Wisconsin Extension, Russ Rasmussen through the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and Justin Chafrin of Stone Laboratory and Ohio Sea Grant. Thank you to each of our speakers for joining us today. So we'll get started hearing from Darren. Darren is a children and youth educator from Michigan State University Extension. A brief bio on Darren is up on the screen for you all to see. Darren has been with MSU Extension since the spring of 1998 in a variety of roles. So we're very excited to have Darren with us today to be talking about Michigan State University's Extension's response to the Flint Water Crisis. So Darren, thanks for being here.
Yeah, and just as you see, there's some staff listed there. There's a lot more staff than that were involved. There was a lot of people involved. I just copied this from another person's presentation, actually. Particularly a lot of this stuff in this presentation is from Deanna East and Aaron Powell and Terry McLean. And I just want to point out that I don't know everything. And this is the best information I have, and I'm taking bits and pieces from a lot of different places. And in the response to the Flint water crisis, that spirit of humility is very important. Before I was a 4-H youth development educator, I was a natural resources educator. And one of the things I said to people is when you're on well water, it's important to get it tested. But when you're on city water, there's government regulations in place to make sure that water gets tested for you to be sure that's safe. I used to tell that to people, and I was wrong. And so this whole experience was very humbling. And when you approach situations like this, that's something to be real aware of. The problem with self-awareness is you don't know when you don't have it. And trying to be really cognizant of that and having trusted colleagues who can point that out is very helpful. And just, I want folks to think about, where does your water come from? Do you know? At home, at work, at a restaurant, when it comes from a bottle, do you know where that water comes from, and how do you know that it's safe? And who are you relying on to make sure that that water is safe? And it's a tough question to think about. Now, historically, Flint has been on the Detroit water system. They took water out of Lake Erie or Lake St. Clair, actually, and sent it through a big pipeline to Flint to drink. And that had been going on since the 60s. And Genesee County and Flint were frustrated with cost increases from that Detroit water system. That line was aging, and there were concerns about major repair or replacement and not having a voice in how those price increases would happen. And so Genesee County and Flint, along with a neighboring county, decided to create the Kewaunee Water Authority to build their own pipeline to get their own source of water from Lake Erie. The Flint River has always been the backup source because federal law requires you to have a backup water supply. And it's been used periodically when they've been working on the pipeline from Detroit and things like that. The Flint River had been used in the past, and never for a long period of time. And because this Kewaunee water line would be putting raw water into the Flint water treatment plant, they would need to make some upgrades to treat that water. Anyway, and so they made the decision to switch over to the Flint River as a source of drinking water. There's a lot of finger pointing that's happened about who made that decision, and court cases going on right now to decide who's culpable and who's not. And after the switch, there were a lot of complaints about odor, color, taste, stomach problems, burning skin, a number of things when that switch happened. And a lot of those concerns were dismissed. Because, for example, if you've been away from your house on vacation or something like that, and you come back, and when you first turn on the water, it may be a little rusty. And that was the assumption of what was going on by some folks. There were a few fecal coliform violations and boil water advisories after that. There was also some concerns with trihalomethanes, which is a breakdown of chlorine. And also there were some Legionnaire's disease cases, including 12 deaths, that was now is suspected to be related to the water switch. A few things why these problems were so significant is because Flint is an aging city. There's a lot of vacant housing. And when the water left the water plant, it was safe. It has to do with the piping system. And there were places where water was supposed to circulate, and it didn't because it wasn't being used or because there were stuck valves. And there was also significantly reduced usage. The residence time in the system was supposed to have been days, and in some cases it was found to have been weeks. And that water just sitting in there for such a long period of time allows bacteria to grow, allows other issues. Mark Edwards from Virginia Tech had some concerns about high lead issues in the water and did some testing. And of course, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha from the MSU College of Human Medicine discovered that there were elevated blood lead levels in children after the switch in certain parts of the city. Some things to get across is it's not the Flint River. It's not the river's fault that these things were happening. There's been mention in the media about historical contamination in the river, and all that river is downstream of where the intake was. The intake is actually upstream of the city of Flint, and it was from lead pipes and lead solder. And for those who don't know, that wasn't banned until 1986. And like many other urban areas, there's a lot of housing stock that is older than 1986 in the city of Flint. Like I said earlier, it's not the river. The river was improperly treated. Corrosion control was supposed to be in place, and it wasn't. And there's a biochemical coating inside of these pipes. And because that corrosion control wasn't there, is why the lead became exposed and put to people. Overall, like I said earlier, there was a cross-program response to this. And one of the struggles was there was a big lack of trust upon city residents for everybody. And within our office, one thing that was very helpful is we had weekly meetings. And it was just whoever could show up to those weekly meetings, because so many things were changing all the time, just to say, what have you heard, what have you heard, what's going on here, what's going on there, just to move those things forward. And trying to, as a staff, to assume you know nothing when you're often seen as an expert in the community, and approach everything with humility and take people where they are is very important. One of the key things, probably the biggest area where we responded was nutrition education. Foods that are high in iron, calcium, and vitamin C are particularly significant in mitigating some of the effects of lead. And so we had increased nutrition classes, taste testings at farmers market and other places, cooking demonstrations related to recipes high in those. We had cooking matters classes with free bags of groceries along with that, and some work study initiatives related to improving nutrition and physical activity. Also, a food pantry and corner store initiative to try to increase the availability of fresh fruits and vegetables in those areas, to make them available to city residents. Some specific publications we got out very quickly. Fight Lead with Nutrition, and a similar one about fighting with play and activity, and a recipe book focused on those specific meals high in those vitamins and minerals I mentioned earlier. We had a lot of strong partnerships in the community to improve that access to food. The biggest one probably is Edible Flint. It's housed here in the Genesee County Extension Office, and it's an organization of neighborhood gardening throughout the community. Very strong program. A few things they did is, along with Extension, they created some lead education workshops, some garden flyers. They got some funding to increase the number of soil tests in the community. They also had hose filters for irrigation that remove lead, and they have garden starter veggie kits that they provide to folks at low cost to make their own community gardens, and they adjusted the vegetables in those kits to increase those lead mitigating nutrients. We worked with some soil specialists on campus to figure out how irrigation might affect contaminated garden produce. And what they found, actually, from doing some calculations at a neighborhood garden through Edible Flint, is that the water use would not lead to a significant increase in soil lead, because the lead was there already from past use, lead-based paint, lead gasoline, and things like that. And actually, the soil on the vegetables, if they weren't washed properly, was a more significant source of lead than what might have increased due to irrigation. Again, other responses, we've got early childhood people fighting lead effects with learning and play. We had a team of us who updated all our home water treatment bulletins because they were written primarily from a well water perspective, not from a treating municipal water perspective. And so there was a team of us that rewrote all those bulletins, and it was interesting as we were writing things. Some of the concerns brought up related to the water crisis just by being there, and the language and things like that had to be changed, and it's hard to think about it unless you were in the process. We also did some things with lead water quality monitoring with youth. I have a program that's been going on for a long time where we do river monitoring, and we expanded that. And we also developed some models to show kids how the water distribution system worked, to help explain why it was, even though the switch to river water precipitated it, that wasn't the only concern. Also things about lead in pets, working with our College of Vet Medicine, and also our contacts with Michigan Milk Producers Association got a donation of milk, which helped mitigate some of the effects of lead. We had a website as well focused just on lead exposure, and also a smartphone app to help provide resources. And again, we had a lot of media response to this, both social media and traditional media, although a lot of that response wasn't reaching the audience that it needed to. Where we are now, there's still a huge lack of trust in not only government but a lot of other agencies by city residents. The lead service lines are all expected to be replaced by 2020, and that's in progress now. Many court cases, both criminal and civil, are in progress right now related to this issue. There were some samples in fall of 2017, about a year ago, and stated that they fell within the threshold set forth. But the issue a lot of residents have is there were 110 samples, and there's a lot more households than that in the city. And even though it fell within the federal lead and copper rules, a lot of folks aren't trusting that. And folks, in many cases, still are not drinking the water. Even if the test results come back as safe, they don't trust it, or they don't know when it could change. And there's some legitimacy to that as well, because as they're working on doing these lead line replacements, in the process, they can shake loose some of that scale inside and put some more contaminants in solution. Many of the short-term funds that were available when the crisis first happened are now gone. For example, here in our office, we had many additional food nutrition staff, and we lost 4 at the end of last month, and we're going to lose another 2 at the end of this month, even though the need is still there. And again, there's many of us who have worked on this, and I'll make my contact information available for those who need it. Thanks.
Thanks, Darren. I appreciate that. That's a really helpful presentation. Next, we're going to turn to Kevin Erb of the University of Wisconsin Extension. He's a conservation professional development and training coordinator there. And as well as he's going to be co-presenting alongside Russell Rasmussen of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Their bios are up on the screen for you now. They're going to be talking a little bit about the water impairment issue in Kewaunee County and what they're doing to determine some alternative solutions and practices. Russ, I believe you're going first, so I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
And yeah, I actually lost the coin toss, so Kevin chose to go second. So this slide basically outlines the issue that we're dealing with in Kewaunee County. And Kewaunee County, for those of you not familiar with Wisconsin, it is in the sort of the right-hand portion of the state. Door County is the county that extends, yeah, there's a good circle there. That's Kewaunee County. And the issue is that we have carbonate bedrock that is very much to being dissolved by rainwater over the years. And it very deep fractures that both horizontal and vertical that makes the groundwater very susceptible to issues where you have shallow soils and that do not help attenuate any pollutants that might be coming from the surface of the soil. So this slide shows the areas of the state where you have shallow soils. The demarcation line is 50 feet, so the darker brown is areas that are less than 50 feet. The lighter brown are areas that are greater than 50 feet. And the reason that Kewaunee County and actually that whole area in the northeast portion of Wisconsin is an issue is because we have a fairly robust agricultural systems there. And a lot of concentrated animal feeding operations, and that basically creates the platform for groundwater issues. So there we go. Back, I'm sorry. So we have shallow soils to a very susceptible bedrock. And just as an example, groundwater may move in more traditional sandstone aquifers, maybe 15, 20 feet a year. It's been documented in this area that groundwater can move up to a quarter mile a day. So it's just like you have a series of pipes in the ground. the bed fractures that have developed. As I said, that soil is very shallow, and the land use is very heavily agricultural, and a lot of large animal operations spreading a lot of manure on the surface of the land. This next slide shows that we had in Kewaunee County alone 15 of these large operations. Actually, we've added one, so this since then 16 now, but also almost 200 other operations that are operating in Kewaunee County alone. And so it's very intensive agriculture, again, many areas with shallow soils and over super sensitive bedrock. This slide kind of shows some pictures of what we're talking about. On the upper left is what we're kind of refer to as a swallet, and the upper right shows 1 feet. All those circles are a number of these swallets, which essentially is a drain into the groundwater. The slide as well, but the picture on the lower right shows where these fractures occur, and where the vegetation is darker is where, of course, the fractures are because of greater availability of water there. And so you can see how pervasive these fractures, it's not showing the vertical ones, of course, but the horizontal ones are shown there. So what essentially occurred was citizens became concerned over groundwater contamination, and they petitioned EPA in October of 2014 through the Safe Drinking Water Act to address the issue there. And EPA and we at DNR got together and moved forward and had a series of 3 meetings, one with government agencies to try to determine what we were doing currently. We had not only state agencies such as our DNR and our Agriculture Department and our Health and Human Services Department and, of course, University of Wisconsin. Federal agencies, EPA, NRCS, USGS were there, and local government, most especially the counties, were represented. Again, to compare notes and to figure out what we were doing currently. The CAFOs to sort of get their input, and finally we met with the petitioners last because we wanted to share with them the results of the first 2 meetings and determine a path forward. And what we ended up doing was setting up 5 work groups, one for short-term solutions to deal with how do we help people whose drinking water has become contaminated in their well, a best management practices group that would look at longer-term solutions. What should we be doing differently in terms of agricultural and other best management practices to address this issue? A compliance group. How do we ensure better compliance with the practices that we were going to determine? And a communication group. How are we going to get this communication out to not only the agricultural producers in the area, but the citizens and others that were interested. So finally, we had an alternative practices group that actually started to meet a little later and is currently meeting on a regular basis even now. Those groups met starting in the summer of 2015 through the spring of 2016, and in June of 2016, we came out with a report of recommendations from these groups. And I want to point out that the groups included not only government, but advocacy folks, the petitioners themselves, citizens, some environmental groups. It included ag producers, crop consultants, manure haulers, and so we had a very deep grassroots effort to discuss the problem, derive solutions, and in parallel with that, our agency funded research regarding the wells. We did extensive well sampling through USDA researchers as well as others to make sure that we were scientifically addressing and identifying exactly what the problem was and the source of the pollution. I might add that we found that while agriculture was a major source of the contamination, septic systems were also a significant source of the issue. And so we looked at recommendations dealing with both. So in the past, basically 2 years, we've been implementing these recommendations. Some of them have included some statutory changes, some of them administrative rule changes, some of them policy changes, some of them basically in the private sector. For example, a farmer-led group started basically as a result of these work group efforts called Peninsula Pride, and they have been working within their group to both implement the recommendations that came out of the work groups, but also they put together a program that would supply water to people whose wells have been contaminated with E. coli. So finally, I would like to just point out that we started a CQI, a continuous quality improvement process. We're reconvening the work groups to look at what their recommendations and how they've been implemented, and looking for feedback regarding were they implemented as intended? Do they need some improvement? Are they working as intended? And trying to evaluate that. The whole point being that this is not a flip a switch and you're going to fix the problem. This is a continuous long-term effort to continually monitor how things are going and seek improvements. So with that, I guess I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Kevin, we're not hearing you.
Are you hearing me now? Test 1, 2?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I have to flip the button on my computer in order to be heard on my phone. Learn something new every day. So my role with this, within Extension, was as a technical member of the Sensitive Areas Work Group. And groundwater incidences, groundwater contamination are something that I've dealt with as an extension educator since my first few weeks on the job in 1992 of the sensitive geologies of Northeast Wisconsin. What was really interesting to me my first couple of springs up here was that about the third week of March or so, every single clothesline that was in the country was filled with whites. And I asked one of my colleagues what's going on, and the reply back was, well, the groundwater is finally clean enough that the farm wives feel confident doing their whites, and they're not going to turn brown because of how bad the water is. Within this particular part of Wisconsin, as Russ said, we have this very sensitive geology. That photo in the lower right that I've left up on the screen from Russ's presentation shows some of those cracks. That's an indication in a hayfield here that our bedrock is less than 3 feet below the surface. So as a part of this, I've been involved in the Northeast Wisconsin Karst Task Force about 10 years earlier. And so what was interesting about this process was that we came into it with very clear expectations. And obviously, as Russ said, this was really kind of motivated, instituted by the citizen legal action in conjunction with EPA to have some impact on the 5 work groups that were part of it. We knew coming in that this was not going to be an easy challenge to fix. As the Karst Task Force report had said in 2007, even if we got rid of every cow, every goose, and every human, i.e. all sources of potential contamination, we're still going to have groundwater quality issues because of the sensitive geology, because surface water is running into the groundwater at a high frequency of points, plus filtering through very shallow soils themselves. So within each of the work groups, one of the things I liked was that we had sometimes 2 15-minute sessions, sometimes 1 25-minute session for citizen input. So throughout the process, not only were we allowing citizens to listen in, to be a part of it, but we were actively encouraging them to comment as we're having our meetings, as we're discussing various potential solutions and ways of dealing with it here. I think one of the really unique things about this particular process, and we saw the same thing in the CARS Task Force report back in 2006, 2007, is we had small groups within the work group. So we had groups of farmers and agronomists. We had groups of concerned citizens that basically came together outside of the meetings to wrestle around certain issues, and we encouraged them to come back with recommendations. And so the citizens groups came back with their ideas. There were groups of farmers and manure applicators, including myself, that met around farm shops and kitchen tables and welders and came back with constructive ideas that then were shared with everybody. Some of those were shot down. Some of those worked very well, and we see a lot of those that were incorporated into the final report. This was a very contentious issue because you had people on both sides that were very entrenched in their belief that there was not a significant role for their industry in the problem versus those that felt that all industries were responsible, some more than others. And so as we struggled with this idea of how do we come to consensus here, within the report itself, what our group ended up doing was we broke our 63 recommendations into two different groups. The priority ones, the one up at the top, were the recommendations that we had consensus on, and then the second tier was recommendations that were proposed. With the recommendations were proposed, we did not have 100% consensus from everybody across the board, but we all agreed that if we followed these recommendations, that progress would be made. And so kind of looking back on what happened, as Russ said, we've seen a lot of progress out of this. State laws have changed. A number of counties in this part of the state have changed their own regulations around land spreading of manure, nutrient management plans, etc. But I think the real positive about this is that we took an issue where there was a lot of contention, a lot of concern, and we really got to a point where we could agree on a lot of things. Obviously, the problem is not solved. We've seen it less contamination instances. In fact, I'm working on a document right now to kind of look at some of that, the actual results of the new regulations that have been put in place. We are seeing that downward trend, and we think that there's a lot of positives out of there. To answer one of the questions that flashed across the screen here a few minutes ago, within our particular work group, we did not have any youth involvement, but I can't speak for any of the other 4 work groups. So with that, I'll wrap up, and Ann, you can go ahead and introduce the next speaker here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kevin and Russ, for speaking with us today about your alternative practices work group and your work in Kewaunee County. Now we're going to be switching gears a little bit for our last speaker. Our last speaker is Justin Shafran. He is a senior researcher and research coordinator with Stone Lab and Ohio Sea Grant. You can see Justin's bio up here on the screen. Justin's going to be talking to us a little bit about his work with the city of Toledo and his research looking at forecasting harmful algal bloom toxins to help prevent future water quality impairments with HAB blooms. So Justin, thanks for being here today.
Hi, thanks. Can everyone hear me?
Well.
Yeah? Okay, great. So I'm from Stone Laboratory. We were located on South Bass and Gibraltar Island in the western basin of Lake Erie. And the research we're working on now is developing a western basin harmful algal bloom toxin forecast. And you can see this background slide is the village of Put in Bay, and this is during a weekend in July 2015, and you can see all the green that was in the harbor that weekend, and it was concentrated up along our docks at Stone Laboratory. We can quantify we can quantify cyanobacterial biomass in large lakes using satellites. Each image that you see on the slide here is a snapshot between 2002 and 2015, and it shows the largest bloom in that given year. Reds are high levels of cyanobacteria. greens are in the middle, blues are low, and black is no cyanobacteria. So you can see there's lots of year-to-year variation in bloom biomass. And we know that we know that year-to-year variation is explained by springtime phosphorus loads from the Maumee River. So in years when we have large rains, we get more runoff, get more phosphorus loaded in the lake, and we get a larger bloom. In drought years, we have less phosphorus and a smaller bloom. And with this relationship, we can develop a cyanobacteria bloom biomass forecast. And at Stone Lab every year, we have a harmful algal bloom forecast in early July that uses the springtime phosphorus load and that relationship. So this was the forecast. You can see in red what was issued in early July this year. Now, as I said, we're working on the toxins the blooms produce. This current forecast is only for biomass. And we can also forecast biomass using the current location that the satellite sees and putting the bloom biomass data into current models to tell us where that bloom biomass is going to be in the next couple of days. And this is what the NOAA Lake Erie HAB bulletin does. It shows you where the bloom is now and where it's going to be in the next couple of days. So that's a biomass forecast. I also want to point out that the images that you see here, these are from last year. These are not this year. However, we're working on toxins, and there are fundamental questions remain about what controls toxin production within the blooms. A toxin forecast cannot simply rely on the cyanobacteria biomass. And if you're concerned about swimming in a beach about toxins, you cannot just look at the water and think it's clear, it's safe in terms of algal bloom toxins, or it's green and it's high in toxins. So this scatter plot shows 831 samples we collected in the Western Basin for the past 5 or 6 years. And you can see there's no real relationship between cyanobacteria biomass on the X and microcystins, which are the main toxins of concern, on the Y-axis. And if we zoom in onto the lower range, within what I'm showing now, 98% of the samples are within these ranges. So there's really no relationship between cyanobacteria biomass and toxins. So the research we're doing on is looking at what explains the lack of this relationship. Some background about microcystins. In August 2014, the city of Toledo had a do not drink advisory that lasted a weekend. It lasted Saturday through a Sunday, affected about 500,000 people. Additionally, the Toledo area hospitals had to cancel all surgeries because they couldn't sterilize their equipment properly. Local businesses closed that weekend, because they couldn't serve water or cook food or anything like that. And the city of Toledo spends an additional $10,000 per day to treat the water for drinking. If you have a bad bloom that lasts several months, that can be over $1 million in excess in water treatment costs. We look at nitrogen in the role of nitrogen in cyanobacteria blooms. We know phosphorus is critically important, but nitrogen has an additional role that phosphorus does not have. The main cyanobacteria genera in Lake Erie is Microcystis, and Microcystis cannot grow or make microcystins without a combined nitrogen source, meaning it needs nitrate or ammonia or organic nitrogens in the water. Microcystis cannot use atmospheric nitrogen like a few other cyanobacteria can. Microcystin toxins are 14% nitrogen by mass. Compare this to a microcystis cell is only 7% nitrogen by mass. Therefore, making microcystins are expensive in terms of nitrogen. We also know that nitrogen is important for biomass. We've been doing a lot of lab experiments where we bring lake water back to the lab and spike it with phosphorus, with nitrogen, or spike it with phosphorus and nitrogen, and you see the result. This is an example from August 2011, which was a fairly large bloom. And you can see when we add phosphorus, it stays at the background control levels, but when we give it nitrogen or phosphorus and nitrogen together, that bloom really takes off. So nitrogen constrains bloom growth. And many other researchers have documented this in Lake Erie and in other lakes, that nitrogen is important for biomass. And this is just a picture of some of the samples we had in the experiments. You can see when you add nitrogen, the bloom really takes off. Looking at toxins, microcystins that are in our experiments follows a similar pattern to biomass. Whereas if in these experiments we looked at different types of nitrogen and whether we give it in one large pulse or several small pulses, all forms of nitrogen increased microcystins. So nitrogen is important for growth and for toxins. We also know that not every microcystis cell in Lake Erie can make the toxins. And if you look at this bottom graph, this is from NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab. This is 2014 data. The bottom graph shows you the ratio of toxic to total microcystis. So in late July, early August 2014, when Toledo had their water treatment issue, about 70% of microcystis in the lake was able to produce toxins. And that corresponds to high levels of nitrate and high levels of microcystins. Later in the summer, if we see nitrate decreasing, we see microcystins decreasing, and only about 10% of the microcystis later in the year was toxic. So we see a shift from toxic strains to non-toxic strains, and that follows nitrate concentrations in the water. So our current objective is to develop a toxin forecast for the Western Basin. We are currently in the first year of a 3-year project. So I don't have results on that to present, but presenting now how we're developing this forecast and what we need to develop this forecast. The first component is we need to be able to model the ratio of toxic microcystis to total microcystis. So when we have a lot of toxic microcystis, we know it's more likely that we're going to get higher levels of toxins, whereas when we have majority of non-toxic strains, we won't get those high levels of toxins. And we know this is affected by nitrogen, which I just showed you, but it's also potentially affected by light intensity or also water clarity. We also need to know the microcystin production rates. So per a given toxic cell, how much microcystis can that one toxic cell produce? And we're doing experiments this summer and next summer to determine production rates at ambient nutrient concentrations and elevated nutrient concentrations. The third component we need to be able to model nitrogen concentrations. And the Western Lake Erie ecosystem model, which was developed by Limnotech, who's based in Ann Arbor, they have this really intricate, complicated process-based model that can forecast many different parameters. I'm showing here 5 different years and at 3 stations in Western Lake Erie. The blue line is nitrate concentrations from the model, and the red dots are observed nitrate concentration data from the University of Toledo, and you see that they match up really well. So we can forecast nitrate concentrations, and we can apply that into how it's going to affect toxin production and the ratio of toxic to total. The fourth thing we need to do is, once we are able to model these parameters, we then need to put them into the forecast, the current model that will move the cyanobacteria and the toxins around the lake. You know, the bloom might get pushed further east and get diluted, or it might get pushed from east to west and concentrate along the Ohio or the Michigan shoreline. And then the last thing we need to know for this toxin forecast is what happens to the microsystems after they're produced. At what rate do they get degraded by bacteria and become non-toxic? So again, what we're doing, we're linking process-based models and field experiments to forecast algal bloom toxicity in Lake Erie. We're integrating the biological parameters from the Western Lake Erie ecosystem model into the FVCOM model, which will grow toxins, will grow cyanobacteria, and then move them around to the lake based on currents. And this project is funded by NOAA, the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Sciences. They're the one that publishes the NOAA Lake Erie Hab Bulletin. Twice a week they send out an email showing where the bloom is and where it's going to be. We're working with them to include our toxin forecast into future bulletins. So this will result in more public awareness of the problem, more public awareness where the toxins are going to be, but ultimately water treatment decisions. So if we have a toxin forecast for what's shown here in the top is that's the Toledo crib. That's where the water is drawn in from Lake Erie. If we can forecast the toxins at that intake several days or weeks in advance, that will allow them time to better prepare to remove those toxins at the water treatment plant, which will ultimately lead to safer water for the consumers. So we have this NOAA EcoHab team is a large team from many universities, many other state agencies have also provided funding. And again, so we're located on South Bass and Gibraltar Island of Lake Erie. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Justin. And thank you to each of our presenters. Now we want to turn it to some Q&A. So please submit your questions for our speakers via the chat box. I see that Darren had another question just pop up. Is there anything showing how zebra mussels are affecting levels of toxic microbes?
Okay, the zebra mussels in Western Lake Erie have a smaller impact on the algal blooms than they do in smaller lakes. From that first images I've shown you, we saw year-to-year fluctuations from big blooms to small blooms to big blooms. That is highly correlated with phosphorus loads. The zebra mussel population, the clogger mussel population, does not change year to year that fast. So there's the impact on Western Lake Erie is not as large as it is in the smaller inland lakes. In the smaller inland lakes, it takes less phosphorus to get a bloom going because the mussels excrete phosphorus and nitrogen back into the water, but they also reject microcystis and other cyanobacteria from their diet. So mussels have a much larger impact on smaller inland lakes on cyanobacteria than they do in Western Lake Erie.
Great question. Thanks, Justin. I don't see any other questions coming from the chat box, so I might insert one of my own while we see if one or two comes in. This question is actually for Darren. Darren, you talked a little bit about lack of trust. I'm curious how you and your work within Extension are dealing with some of those lack of trust issues now moving forward after the water crisis.
Well, Extension was a more trusted resource within the community. We don't have data to back this up. This is just anecdotal. Than other sources. But as far as going into the future, that's a potential opportunity for us. We haven't done anything right yet, but potentially for some of our state and local government folks to figure out how to improve trust.
Yeah, interesting. I see another question that just come in from Austin. I believe this question is directed towards Justin. You said light intensity may affect microcystin presence. What other abiotic factors may impact its presence?
Well, the main factor is temperature. We don't see microcystis or cyanobacteria blooms when the water's cold. We only see them in the midsummer, fall, when the water is warmer. So once the temperature is warm enough, then if you have the nutrients, the phosphorus and nitrogen from the rivers, that will lead to a bloom. But they also need microcystis needs relatively a lot of light compared to other cyanobacteria, and it can get light. It can access the light in muddy waters by floating towards the surface. So those are the three main things. It needs temperature, it needs the phosphorus and nitrogen, and it needs light levels.
Okay, looks like we have another question from Lois for Justin. Are microcystins bioaccumulative in fish, or is there any research looking at the impact of microcystins on fish?
We did a study a couple years ago. We partnered with charter boat captains, and we still do partner with charter boat captains to help us collect water samples. But in 2013 and 14, they took samples of walleye tissue flays, and we had them analyzed for microcystins. And what we say is that if you follow the recommended guidelines, if you follow the recommended consumption guidelines, you have no worries about for microcystins in fish tissue. If you were to eat a lot of walleye, you would be more concerned about mercury in fish tissues than you would microcystins. So they're non-detect to trace levels in the walleye. So that's not an issue for the walleye. But there are other studies that are ongoing that are using different analytical methods. And I believe so far they've got similar results. So right now, microcystins are not an issue for fish consumption. But that might be different for other parts of the world where the fish are exposed to microcystins year-round, or people might eat the entire fish rather than just the mussels. But for the normal Lake Erie walleye angler, they're not too big of an issue.
Okay, great news for walleye eaters in the area. Another question for Justin. Has anyone discussed applying the toxin forecasting process or tools to other algal bloom hotspots like Green Bay? What would it take? Do the WLE forecasts include easy-to-interpret geospatial maps for public consumption?
So for the biomass, we are relying on satellite imagery, and if the lake is large enough, satellites can detect cyanobacteria. So like Green Bay or Saginaw Bay, and many of the larger inland lakes. To develop that toxin forecast that we're on, you'll need to have all the process-based models, the nutrient loading input data. So there's a lot of factors that are going into our model that we are kind of already using. We're using data from from the water treatment plants in Ohio. We're using data that's collected by Heidelberg University from the rivers. We're using the satellite data from NOAA, and then we're also doing our own experiments. So there's a lot of data needs to be collected in order to build these models.
Absolutely. I don't see any other questions coming in. We do have just a couple minutes left, so I might sneak in one more question for Kevin and Russ. One question that I had, Kevin and Russ, how did your work group in particular interface with the community in Kewaunee County?
And I'll let Russ take that one.
Well, I think that we included the community in the work group. We early on, one session I didn't mention is that we attended a meeting that was held, an evening meeting that was held by the Kewaunee County Land Conservation Committee, where people came and spoke about their concerns on the issue, and of course we listened to those concerns. But this was as we were forming the work groups, and there were several citizens that had spoken there that were very articulate, obviously very well informed, obviously very passionate about the issue. And after the session, under the mantra that no good deed goes unpunished, I went up to those folks and asked them to be a part of the work group, and they agreed. And so so we had we engaged the citizenry, I guess, as part of the solution. And like I said in my presentation, we had this communications work group that talked about what is the best way to get the word out to people on the various recommendations. And each recommendation, or maybe I would say set of recommendations, sort of lent itself to a different communication strategy. But we have brochures and fact sheets that are at the county offices, for example, that the county makes available to people coming in, say, to get water tests, and what are options available to them as far as if their test comes up with contamination of concern, what do they do about it, that sort of thing. So to answer your question completely, it would be, I would need the entire hour probably, but it varies a lot according to the recommendation that we're trying to address.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Well, we are right at 3 o'clock, so each of our presenters' emails and contact information is up on the screen here, should you want to contact them for more information about their presentation today or for more information about their work. And I'd like to thank all of you for being on the call today, as well as thank our presenters for joining us. I do want to let you know about two other upcoming events. We do have another webinar coming up on October 22nd. That's a Monday at 1 p.m. And that webinar is actually hosted by our climate team, the North Central Climate Collaborative, and they're going to be talking about the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment. You can register for that on their website. And I also want to let you know about an event we are co-hosting coming up this December in Indianapolis, the North Central Region 1 Water Action Forum. This is a collaborative event with 4 different organizers working to ensure we have all perspectives as we try to create a cohesive and inclusive plan for watershed management in the region. So I encourage you to check out some more information on our forum website and hopefully join us for that event as well. Thank you everyone for being here today on Imagine a Day Without Water. Have a great rest of your day.